Today we are focusing on experimental poetics, which is such an exciting theme. I mean, I myself am very excited to know what the poets and Dorothy have in mind for us. So, first of all, I would like to introduce to you Professor Dorothy Wang, a bit of background of her work. And Professor Wang, she has a very important book called Thinking is Presence, Form, Race, and Subjectivity in Contemporary Asian American Poetry, published by Stanford University Press in 2013, which received the Association for Asian American Studies Award for Best Book of Literary Criticism back then in 2016, and has also honorable mention in the Poetry Foundation's first Picasso's Awards for Criticism. It was also selected for the New Yorker's book, The Books We Loved, in 2016. So the first national conference on race and creative writing in the US was named after Thinking is Presence as well. So Wang conceived and co-founded the Race and Poetry and Poetics in the UK research initiative and published criticism on Asian and Australian literature. She has taught as a visiting professor at Lingnan University in Hong Kong, as well as in Dashisha University in Kyoto. And she's currently chair of the American Studies program at Williams College in Massachusetts. I think so. I will introduce the poets in terms of their reading order. I think just so we can, slowly go along and understand that their works in depth. So first of all, we will have Jay, who is going to read for us first, and Jay Ying, as some of you might know, he is a Chinese-Scottish poet and MFA student at Brown University currently. His writing has appeared very widely in prestigious literary magazines, including Granta, Guardian, White Review, Poetry Review, and 3AM. He's the author of 3 pamphlets, Wedding Beasts, Catabasis, and Travesty 58, which is launching next year. He's a contributing editor for the White Review as well. Let's welcome Jay.
Hi, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here and to be in the space. Thank you, Jenny, for organizing it. I am I'm going to share my screen, I think. So what I'm reading today comes from my forthcoming pamphlet, Travesty 58, coming out with Spam Press in 2022, so next year. It's part of a sort of longer hypertextual project, Techno-Ching, which is a sort of reconstruction of the ancient Chinese divination text known in English as the I Ching. The pamphlet focuses on hexagram 58, which is the joyous lake, as its central motif. And I wanted to sort of write a series of poems which de-orientalizes Richard Wilhelm and Carl Jung's sort of fairly hegemonic translation of the I Ching, but then to sort of maybe playfully re-orientalize some of the sort of fragments and detritus left over in the deconstruction. So the pamphlet loosely follows various components of the I Ching, but also expands its scope to include themes of, sort of eco-poetics, travel, and racialized subjecthood. So I'm going to share. Okay, you see this? Yes, should be a poem called 8 of Cups. So 8 of Cups. Excused from epic duties, I wandered on the blue veins of our old magistral railways, across the world's cold neck, ironclad anxious stations below that great conjunction. The lymphatic train from Kiev to the Bay of Japan pushing out across the acidic soil. So far from home, how many ghosts could I run into? Friendly faces resurfaced like primeval steam from every transcontinental seam in the ground. I dreamt I packed my own quiet lives away onto their berths. Once, twice, each violent act, successive, never quite successful, 64 taxonomies of death. At Ulan Ude, I followed the sun, the moon, as they split apart into 8 time zones like a dry mandarin. Later, I swallowed 2 pills as silent as classical marble without water. That city's bust of Lenin survived enough to guard the gate's decay from contemporary invasion. At the platform, I scraped wet snow from a cobalt patina to throw like salt, superstitious rituals for lost luggage. I was alive enough to notice missing birdsong from the nearby valleys. I could only hear a hollowed out gouge between mountains, the vain vigil of fir trees slouch and gossip like neighbors barely approving. When I asked for triple vacancies by a lodge, halfway at the sloped border where the wood bison have overrun, I am told to come back after the on-season. I circled a line from a poem in the hotel's brochure. When I was alone in the world, everything breathed. They tried to convince me it was not too late to book a guided expedition, but warned that all their myrmidons were still sleeping. I could visit the lake. I could capture each shadow rewilded by the pale water's rift. Like a rare bird I cannot name, I circled that town for days, only to check myself in. Lonely, back on my bed, I shuffled wet pages from my guidebook as a deck of cards. In search for one itinerary towards extant industry, traveler's tip. The misfortune of coming joyousness lies in the fact that its place is not the proper one. But my path stretched on and on as a walk with no endpoint, no hope of return, but always divine the rising steps, those black words that carry me across the precipice. Where past the evergreens I spy 1,000 white tigers stop and start their journey towards the east. A herd of space crawling ceaselessly into the horizon, gaps with the thrust of lava, waiting for its redirection. And so the next part of this section, what I've actually done is taken the poem I've just read, and I've incorporated a sort of procedural digital language programming technique to introduce a sort of travesty, a ruin to it, in order to remix it, to explore the possibilities of movement and predictions, to lean into the prophetic. And in my pamphlet, there's a quote by the poet D.S. Marriott, where he writes, "Destroying philosophy is not the same as creating a poem." So I wondered, can I destroy a poem in order to create a philosophy? So this poem is called The Lines. 9 at the beginning means, excused from epic duties, I wandered on the lake, on the mountains. I could capture each shadow rewilded by the world. Everything divined, breathed, resurfaced. I followed the train, the steps, the gaps, the classical lava. They tried to convince me across the precipice, where past the evergreens, 1,000 white myrmidons stop and start their hollowed sleeping. Once, twice, I could visit ground. I barely survived enough to spy a lodge halfway at the sloped border with no endpoint, no hope of returning east. When I was alone, 2 pills is the vigil only for this world. As silent as a walk I shuffle, as a traveler I cannot name. 9 in the second place means, excused from the horizon, I wandered on the world's tip. The misfortune of our old magistral railways swallowed across the blue sun like a line gouged from a poem in the hotel's brochure. When I was contemporary, I dreamt I was never quite superstitious. Water is ceaseless without decay. The fact is, the city's space stretched on and on. Its place is not a herd crawling for days on the world's path. Lonely, back at the platform, I scraped wet pages from my guidebook. At the platform, I scraped wet snow from a dry mandarin. At the platform, I scraped wet rituals from marble veins. 6 in the third place means, excused from home, halfway slouch a day only to check myself in after the vain season. 8 taxonomies of steam from a guided line. When I followed the path overrun from patina, past the primeval platform, I scraped a cold expedition, blue misfortune, a redirection, Pale cobalt ghosts past the proper gate. Not too late to book a deck of cards to carry a neck. A coming joyousness lies in the fact that below a great conjunction, 1,000 industry white tigers return to spy on anxious neighbors. 9 in the 4th place means, excused from the seam, I wandered on the ironclad sun, the moon, where everything lymphatic breathed. They tried to throw me with no hope of divine return into the overrun east, pushing out, waiting for days on the world's rift. The thrust of wood bison I followed. Like a rare bird, I circled the ground invasion. Lives away, successful, I could capture each acidic shadow, each cold neck, each friendly face. 9 in the 5th place means, excused from the world's bust of fir trees, waiting for transcontinental luggage, I was alive enough to notice missing valleys, lost extant birdsong coming back. When I asked for 64 vacancies by those rising black words at the Salt Lake, I dreamt I could only hear my own quiet gossip. So in search for one itinerary, I asked, how many ghosts now guards the city's stations? 6 at the top means excused from everything violent. They try to split apart trees from home, death from action, steps from journey, and warn their birth from packed return. Excuse me, my guide, my ceaseless approval. And I think, I think that's all I'd like to read. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jay. This is brilliant. This is just amazing. And you can have a look at the chat, at all these comments, rushing in. And so, shall I introduce the next poet to read her work? So, be Jane. Jane Wong, I'm so excited. She has a new book coming out. So Jane Wong is the author of How Not to Be Afraid of Everything from Alice James books, coming out literally next month, I think, and Overpour by Action Books. A Kundiman Fellow, she is the recipient of a Pushcart Prize and fellowships and residencies from Harvard's Woodbury Poetry Room and the Fulbright Program, Artist Trust, Fine Art Work Center, Bread Loaf, Hedgebrook, Willowpay Bay, the Gentile Foundation, and others. And she's currently an associate professor of creative writing at Western Washington University. Let's welcome Jane.
Thank you, Jenny. And I'm so excited to read with you all. And thank you everyone for being here. I think I'm going to start my reading by putting on this fur coat. So one second. And I'm going to share a quick story before I read my first poem. And that is, and I don't know if you remember, Marilyn, but this was many, many years ago, and it was at one of those AWPs, maybe Boston, not sure. But I remember I felt someone touch the back of my fur collar. I think it was a different one. And I turn around and it's you, and you're like, I love that I love that fur coat. And you also were like, oh, are you a wild girl poet? And I was like, absolutely. And my friend Sally Wenmao was there too. So anyway, that moment with the fur coat really stayed with me. And my mother, bought the first thing she bought with her money when we grew up in a restaurant. I grew up in a restaurant, was to buy this fur coat, which is the most extravagant, ridiculous thing because, we lived paycheck to paycheck. So she just was like, forget it. I want this vintage fur coat. And so I wrote this poem called I Put on My Fur Coat, and it's in my mother's voice. And I actually did put on her fur coat when I wrote it. So I was thinking a lot about experimental poetics. For me is a matter of embodiment. I like to to do something in order for the poem to happen, like a kind of invocation, so to speak. And so that is a lot in my process. A lot of people don't see that, the behind the scenes, like what I do to write a poem, but I definitely wrote a poem in my mom's fur coat when I wrote this poem. And thanks for the shout out for the new book. My copies just arrived, and this poem is, all these poems are in this new book too. Yeah, this is I Put on My Fur Coat. And again, this is my mother's voice. I put on my fur coat and leave a bit of ankle to show. I take off my shoes and make myself comfortable. I defrost a chicken and chew on the bone. In public, I smile as wide as I can, and everyone shields their eyes from my light. At night, I knock down nests off telephone poles and feel no regret. I greet spiders rising from underneath the floorboards, one by one, hello, hello. Outside, the garden roars with ice. I want to shine as bright as a miner's cap in the dirt dark, to glimmer as if washed in fish scales. Instead, I become a balm and salve my daughter, my son, the cold mice in the garage. Instead, I take the garbage out at midnight. I move furniture away from the wall to see what we hide. I stand in the center of every room and ask, am I the only animal here? Okay, that's from my mom. The next poem I'm going to be reading is called After Preparing the Altar, the Ghosts Feast Feverishly. I know that's a mouthful. This poem, maybe I can, let's see if I can screen share actually, just so you can see the form just briefly. If the technology will allow me to do so. Hopefully you can see that. I kind of have to move it over. Maybe. I could just show you the form and then stop screen sharing. But I thought it was kind of funny when I wrote this poem and one of my students saw it. They said that it looks kind of like empty spaces for an eel to move through. And I thought that was so cool that my students said that, like there's like little spaces for an eel to move through. So I just wanted to show you that and then I'll read it. So this poem is a poem that is very close to my heart. It's for my ancestors, my family members who did not survive the Great Leap Forward. And my second book really dives into my family members who did not survive the famine, and my grandfather who did survive the famine, and what it means for us to not talk about the things that are so painful. We don't talk about starvation, we just say they disappeared. And so for a long time, I was writing these letters to my ancestors who perished, my great aunts and my great grandparents. And for a long time, they wouldn't talk to me. And then one day I was actually at a coffee house here in Bellingham grading, of all things, not very fun to grade. And my ghosts actually were like, nope, stop, you need to write this poem down, we're ready to talk. And I literally put aside the grading and I wrote this poem in about 2 hours, and I haven't really touched it since. So it came out in a very strange way. It took me, I've been thinking about writing this poem for 2 years and I couldn't do it. And so here it goes. It's called After Preparing the Altar, the Ghosts Feast Feverishly. And it actually is in the voice of my ghosts, and they're having a giant party. So here they are. We wake in the middle of a life, hungry. We smear durian along our mouths, sing soft death a lullaby, carcass breath, eros of licked fingers and the finest perfume. What is love if not rot? We wear the fruit's hulls, a spiked crown, grinning in green armor, death to the grub, fat in his milky shuffle, death to the lawlessness of dirt, death to mud and its false chocolate, to the bloated sun we want to slice open and yoke all over the village. We want a sun-drenched slug feast, an omelet loosening its folds like hot jello. We want the marble of fat of steak and all its swirling pink galaxies. We want the drool, the gnash, the pluck of each corn kernel raw and summer swell. Tears welling up oil, order up, pickled cucumbers piled like logs for a fire, like fat limbs we pepper and succulent in. Order up, shrimp chips curling in a porcelain bowl like subway seats. Grapes peeling from bitter bark, almost translucent like eyes we would rather see. Little girl, what do you leave, leaven in your sight, death to the open eyes of the dying? Here, there are so many open eyes, we can't close each one. No, we did not say the steamed eye of a fish. No eyelids fluttering like no butterfly wings. No purple yam lips. We said eyes, still and resolute as a heartbreaker. Does this break your heart? Look. We don't want to be rude, but we want seconds, please. We want globes of oranges swallowed whole like a basketball, or Mars, or whatever planet is the most delicious. Slather Saturn, ferment Mercury, lap up its film of dust, yuck sung, seconds, thirds, fourths, meat wool, a bouquet of chicken feet, a garden of melons, monstrous in their bowls, prune back nothing. We purr in this garden. We purr and purr in this garden. We come out with berries and come out so blue, little girl. Lasso tofu, the rope slicing its belly clean. Deep fry a cloud so it tastes like bitter gourd or your father leaving. The exhaust of his car charred. Serenade a snake and slither its tongue into yours and bite. Love, what is love if not knotted in garlic? Child, we move through graves like eels, delicious with our heads first, our mouths agape, our teeth, little needles to stitch a factory of everything made in China. You ask, are you hungry? Hunger eats through the air like ozone. You ask, what does it mean to be rootless? Roots are good to use as toothpicks. You, how can you wake up in the middle of a life? We shut and open our eyes like the sun shining on tossed pennies in the forgotten well. Bald copper, blood, Yu Choi bolts into roses down here. While you were sleeping, we woke to the old leaves of your backyard shed and we ate that, and then we ate one of your lost flip-flops too. In a future life, we saw rats overtake a supermarket with so much milk we turned opaque. We wake to something boiling. We wait to wash dirt from lettuce, to blossom into your face, aphids along the lashes. Little girl, don't forget to take care of the chickens squawking in their mess and stench. Did our mouths buckle at the sight of you devouring slice after slice of pizza and the greasy box too? Does this frontier swoon for you? It's time to wake up. Wake the tapeworm who loves his home. Wake the ants, let them do-si-do a spoonful of peanut butter. Tell us, little girl, are you hungry, awake, astonished enough? So that is that poem. I was going to read another poem, but I'm like, I think I might be over time, so I might pause there. If I have no idea.
Dorothy,
Sorry.
would you like to?
I'm fine. You can keep. I mean, Jane, it just depends on how long the other poem is. Yeah.
I'll pause there, and if there's extra time.
That was great. That was a great poem to end on.
So before I go, I did want to share, speaking of my, again, like, I really like process stuff, like in my, and even thinking about that poem and the other poems I've been writing, I've been making ceramic dumplings, and they've been really fun to make and do. So I'm very interested in process and where the poem comes from. So thanks all for listening.
Thank you very much, Jane. This is just brilliant. I'm just so, excited about all your poems, especially just now the hunger poems, and that's just absolutely gorgeous. So we'll let the audience or Dorothy talk to you a bit further later on. But now shall we also welcome Marilyn, and I'm sure that many of us already know who Marilyn is. There's no need to introduce her, but I would just say something anyway, and for everyone. Marilyn, she was born in Hong Kong and raised in Portland, Oregon. Her books have become Asian American classics, really, and are taught in classrooms internationally. Her most recent book, A Portrait of the Selfless Nation, new and selected poems, and other books including Heart Love Province, Rhapsody in Plain Yellow, Dwarf Bamboo, The Phoenix Gone, The Terrace Empty, and Revenge of the Mooncake Vixen. She has won numerous awards, including the Ruth Lilly Prize for Lifetime Achievement in Poetry, the Ennisfield Wolf Book Award, and the Radcliffe Institute Fellowship at Harvard, the Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship, and the A's Stetner Fellowship, Penn Josephine Miles Award, and others. In 2017, she was honored by the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus and the California Assembly for her activism and excellence in education. Marilyn is also Professor Emerita at San Diego State University and Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. So, Marilyn, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just so pleased to be here with my friends. I love to jam with my friends. I feel so excited. Am I triggering you by wearing too much red and too much embroidery? Experimentalists. Oh my gosh, I didn't wear black. Okay. Okay. So I've been working on, for many years, I've been working on, what I call Chinese American quatrains, and inspired by the cut verse dredge form from classical Chinese poetry, and I mix the dredge form with the Western ballad. But recently I reconceived the quatrain and I compose them into little compressed boxes, and the boxes will morph into little girls and morph back to boxes, and they're inspired by visual art. Visual art. I was a lantern artist at Marfa, Texas, and I saw Donald Judd's boxes, and I also was creeped out by Joseph Cornell's boxes in Chicago. So these inspired my pieces, and you can read them all on. I'm going to read 3 short sequences, and you can read them in the Poetry Foundation website. They're all collected there. The first sequence is called the Girl Box series. I gaze at the ceiling, I stare at the floor, to my left sorrow, to my right a wall. Place 3 girls in one room. One will laugh, one will cry, one will excel in silence. Some born small, some born smaller, some have smallness thrust upon them. Deformed, unfinished, sent before my time. I am subtle, crushed at the edges. I am sublime. Go on, say it. Little box is not a hoo-ha. Open wide, hinge back, scream. No one is listening. Box pantoum. Can't you dream out of the box? Marbles rattling in your brain. Your mother was in pain. She said no when she meant yes. Marbles rattling in your brain. You will never amount to anything. She said no when she meant yes. Sickness, death, and despair. You will never amount to anything. Your mother was in pain. Sickness, death, and despair. Can't you dream out of the box? Merritt Oppenheim. Little box does not wear a mink coat. Her name is not Merritt Oppenheim. Box measures. You are a freak, a cuboid, a weirdo trapezoid, a rhomboid asswipe, a four-eyed coalition. You are flat as a board, titless as a parallelogram, a straight line. What's your point? A broken system. Go back to where you came from. The great square. The great square has no corners. The great tone makes a tiny sound. The great image has no form. The great mother has no proof. The great square is finally silent. The long march ends in death. I do not want to die in a box, says mother. I want to laugh in open air. This sequence is called Little Box. Little Box opens up. Little Box talks back with a new set of teeth and pink gums, a fake nose and a wax mustache. She disguises her voice to sound like Groucho. Little Box opens up and cries to her psychiatrist. I don't know why they hate me. I'm such a sweetheart. I volunteer at the zoo and teach Mandarin to their bratty children. Little Box is not happy to see you. So she closes herself up for months, years, decades, 2 millennia. She tacks up a sign that says Nirvana. Little Box is undead. She sleeps all day in a coffin, hands over chest. At night, she cruises the mall for juicy victims. She prefers type A, but AB if she has to. What can you say? Vampires can't be choosy. She likes your stupid brother. Little Box is on the psychiatry couch. Everybody hates me. Nobody loves me. Little Box lies on her side and spills her guts. What's in Little Box? A perfect orchid, a chocolate-covered strawberry, a new iPhone with a glittery sleeve, amber earrings from Pushkin, keys to a new Porsche, a retro Chanel brooch, a Getty Science left ear, a czar's penis. Gifts so rare, please don't stare. What's in Little Box? Rancid chow mein, a sliver of cold pizza, last week's hummus. You're a starving orphan from East Brooklyn, and you eat it. So you want to fuck Little Box. You want to know her secret. She won't open up. She won't give it up. And you are generally repelled by her filthy ape ribbon. You want to do the Little Box. You are a sorry story, you big creep. Why don't you get off the couch and find a real girlfriend? Boss Box, white, square, and without a soul. Please don't analyze Little Box. She's just cardboard clogging the landfill. Her mother, precious jade purse, has been regifted. Little girl etudes. They throw stones at the little girl. Over and over, they throw stones. They who are their fathers, they who are their brothers. They burn the veil of the little girl, the pink one, her favorite, not too short, not too long, with gilded filigree. They burn it. They play double dutch with the little girl. Jump, jump. They are surprised by her fast feet, amazed at her swift tongue. Birdie, birdie in the sky, drop some whitewash in my eye. Birdie, birdie in the sky. Gee, I'm glad that cows don't fly. They like to chase the little girl up the block, through the narrow alley, through the barbed wire, onto the roof, over the train tracks, down the gulch. They point their finger at the little girl. They shout, brat, maggot, whore, come back and feed your brother and wash the floor. They like to hit the little girl. The big one might hit back and wait till the wee hours to whack you with an axe. They kidnap little girls, chibak, schoolgirls, make them sex slaves and kitchen slaves. They like to kidnap Yashidi girls, Shabain girls, daughters of Shiloh. They like to sell little girls up the river for a few pounds of opium, 1,000 American dollars. She's just a girl. What does it matter? They like to adopt little girls from distant villages. They make lovely daughters. The boys aren't easy. They climb the walls and are dyslexic. And the Asian girls are, you know, smarter. They like to bury little girls, mounds in Nanjing, in abandoned churchyards, around the maquiladoras, along a border fence marked by wilted flowers and a crooked cross. To everything, there is a season in heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to grieve, a time to dance, a time to throw stones, a time to gather them, a time for little girls in heaven. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Marilyn. Just so kind of, you know, your daring poetry is just like always kind of such a powerful influence for everyone. Thanks so much. So I would like to know, you know, maybe Dorothy, would you like to, you know, moderate the conversation with all the poets, and we'd love finding out more about their work and, you know, how they have dialogue with each other.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny, for organizing this event. It's such a pleasure to see Marilyn, an old friend, and we've had many conversations about poetry and many things, and meeting new poets, Jane and Jay. Wonderful to hear your work. So I'm excited. So I just have a few questions to ask the three of you, and then I wanted to open it up to the audience, and people can feel free either. If you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can put a question in the chat. I guess the chat, not the Q&A. Oh, no, there's a chat. Yeah, the chat. And then if people feel like addressing people directly, they can just unmute and ask. You can either be on camera or not. It doesn't really matter. So I'm going to start off. Actually, originally I was going to start with a question about what is experimental, but just inspired by Marilyn's reading, I'm actually going to take the conversation to my second question, which we can get back to the question of what is experimental later, but several of you already spoke about your experimentation formally. I actually am quite curious about Asian affect or Chinese affect, just based on what you read, Marilyn. And I'm thinking very much about, there's sort of interlinked questions here, because I'm thinking about this last year or so of just anti-Asian violence. Less so in the UK, I guess, but very much so in the United States. And of course, Jay has been in the United States, even though he's from Scotland. So, because I had been listening to a presentation by the deaf Asian American artist, Christine Sun Kim, and she lives in Berlin, but she spoke about even in Germany, that she felt for the first time, or she felt in the last year of the pandemic, people moving away from her. So I'm just curious about how we're still in the pandemic, but this last year or so of the pandemic has affected the way you've written poetry, or the way you perceive yourselves as Asian American, or I guess Chinese British. And it's tied to the question of the acceptable range of affect that Asian people are allowed to have, and actually to perform, or are allowed to have in poetry, but also in real life. And so one thing I love about, you know, of course, I've written on Marilyn's poetry, is this kind of like letting the little girl or the woman express rage, which is so unacceptable, both in Asian culture and in Western culture, right? So I'm just curious, and this is of course very much affected by issues of gender, sexuality, class, ideology, but I'm just wondering about this last pandemic year and the effect it's had on all of you all in your writing of poetry. Yeah. Anyone?
I guess I'll do it. I feel like I am just like break the silence of sorts. It's been a hard time. I think that, you know, I've actually haven't been writing much, and I think that sometimes I've been really thinking about cooking. And as I kind of showed you my ceramics, I've been wanting to do things that feel nourishing and like use my hands. I was joking around, but not really. But this past like whole time, I grew up in a restaurant and I've never ever cooked. Like I was surrounded by people who cooked for me and kind of ushered me out of the kitchen. They're like, we want you to go to college. We want you to do things. Just get out of the kitchen. And for the first time in my life, you know, in my like late 30s, I'm cooking for the first time ever. And those dishes, that soup, making juk, like that's a poem for me. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And also when you're talking about rage, Dorothy and Marilyn, I feel like I'm so grateful for your work in the sense of like, I feel so rageful. And there's something about being enraged in community that's a different type of rage than that which is an internal by myself type of rage. The first poem actually in my book is called Mad, and it begins with anger. It begins with anger, and it's actually written as Mad Libs, and that you can fill in the blanks. And so there's something about anger that I think can be, I don't know, restorative in community. To be angry together feels like what I've been feeling like during COVID, as well as cooking soup and nourishing my community and myself. And so I've been feeling basically like I've been eating and I've been screaming. So I'll just like, that's my answer.
Who's going to, am I?
You
Go
go
ahead.
next. Then.
I go next. Okay. I guess I'm just filled with rage, and it's interesting coming out with the selected in that, you know, it's a collection of, it's sort of some, you know, 30 years. It's a selection from 30 years of work. The old poems are coming back, you know. Coming back in fashions. Students would ask me to read some, you know, my old rah Asian American power girl anthems, and they want to hear them. And it's very interesting that we're coming to a moment in which it's very important to speak out. It's important, to show solidarity with African American poets, with other, and shout for our rights. And I've been rereading Richard Wright. I've been rereading some important Black writers, Black poets, and been listening to Black poetry and reading Black poetry. And I think I don't know. It's very interesting that we're coming back to a moment in which we all need to be, to speak out in these political. I need to write political anthems, which I've been doing all my life. And sometimes there'll be, there are years in which language poets won't invite me to do readings because they're not into identity poetry or not into angry poems. You're not supposed to, speak out or shout out. So it's interesting that this moment that that people want to hear. They want to hear from us. They want to, we need to show our pain. I mean, it's just we're so bottled up. And even when I'm writing these little tiny quatrains, the quatrains have to be implosive and explosive. They have to, carry the weight of the world. And so yeah. And I always get beat up by people. There's a lot of road rage. And somebody a few months ago told me to go back to China and go eat bat shit and stuff like that. I mean, so so it's in our face, you know, it really, right now, things are in our face. This hatred, this racism is in our face, and we have to respond.
Thank you. Jay, do you want to say a word?
Yeah, I mean, I totally vibe with what Marilyn and Jane you said. I think for me personally, it's been interesting making that move from the UK to the US during the pandemic and not having many opportunities to go back home to my family who live in Scotland. Because there's this sort of strange feeling that, yes, coming to the US in a way, there's just been a much more established lineage of Asian American poetry than in the UK, right? So I feel like I'm being welcomed by that, but equally realizing that, you know, the definition of what Asian means still does vary, you know, and like a really simple thing would be, you know, here when you say Asian American, lots of people don't mean South Asian people. But in the UK, if I said Asian British, that, you know, usually would mean South Asian people, you know, would be the first people to come to mind. So that's a really tiny difference, right? But it's sort of, but that's been something I've been trying to think about. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think Asian American here usually does include South Asian American, but I think there are very fraught issues of South Asian Americans and Southeast Asian Americans feeling marginalized. So, but I agree with you, Jay, that and certainly in the UK, when you say Asian, it means South Asian. Mm-hmm. And I think, right, for Chinese, they would say Chinese British or something, yeah. Right? But no, that's interesting, having made that, for you to have made that move during the pandemic. So I am going to ask a question now more about form, which is that I don't think it's a secret that, you know, you guys know that my belief is that form is deeply political. It is not separate from politics. And so, of course, who's defined what is experimental has been generally high modernist, fracturing of syntax, certain kinds of moves. And Marilyn and I have talked about this, about if you use like the influence of Chinese poetry, that's not considered experimental, right? Or Jane embodiment, that's not considered experimental necessarily. So I'm thinking through, you know, how, you know, English departments are kind of fading right now. I think it's a sign of many things, but one of the signs I think is that the British Empire and the influence of the UK has sort of waned in some ways, just for many reasons. Things are shifting around. So one of the things to think about is just English and the tie, because when you think about diaspora, it's not only this kind of racial or ethnic tie. Like poets like you all are tied by the English language, English poetic tradition that didn't include you all, right? It didn't include you, that tradition. So the questions, are you very aware of the weight of the expectation or the reception of you all as Asian American, you know, Chinese British writers? Because when I was listening to the poems, for example, signifiers like food or the East or, you know, things like that, they're very charged, right? So the problem is that often critics will read Orientalist meaning into poems, even when no one intends that. So I know, for example, for Marilyn, Chinese poetry has been an influence, but for other Asian American poets, it hasn't been. But people will still read some kind of like, you know, Oriental thing. So I'm wondering, when you all are writing, just thinking through form, I don't even know if you think of it consciously, but what are those issues weighing on you? Or how are you grappling with that tradition and these formal questions that are deeply imbued with colonial assumptions, frankly, I think.
I don't mind going, perhaps. Yeah, I think this is a super interesting point. And, you know, going back to the question of the reader, the critic, and being in the UK, and I'm sure, you know, the other Chinese British poets in this webinar would agree that, because, you know, it's been a fairly recent phenomenon. You know, Sarah Howe's Loop of Jade was published, what, less than 10 years ago, you know? That there does seem to be more of an expectation, a burden, you know, And I do think about that. It's hard to not think about that, you know, but I guess for me, I'm interested in sort of subverting what they might expect of me in some ways. And that, I think, is the sort of difficulty that I want to imbue into my poems. And, you know, I go back to this idea of difficulty, and I think difficulty can be, you know, done in various different ways, you know. I think, for example, the excerpt I just read would be difficult for someone who didn't really know much about the I Ching, even though some people do generally know, you know, and perhaps I should have included more contextual information before I was reading. But, you know, similarly, I mean, I think all poets do this, you know, they draw from different sorts of areas. And speaking for myself, I'm fascinated by sort of like Greek mythology and classics, you know, and so whether the critic reads more into that or into the sort of Oriental tropes, that's their sort of, you know, burden, their guilt, you know, and I still think it says a lot, but yeah.
I really like what you're saying here, Jay, about kind of like, you know, that's like, it says a lot as to how they're responding, I think, to our work versus, you know, kind of what we're aiming to do, which is such a huge, like, I guess like a huge distance between that. I was thinking a lot about kind of these markers of quote unquote Chineseness, etc. And we all have complicated relationships, obviously, with identity. And, you know, for a long time, especially when I was doing my graduate school work, I didn't write anything that would ever identify myself as a quote unquote Chinese American writer. And I think that was done to me. Like, I think that I was being told, and this is kind of what you're saying, Dorothy, about kind of, you know, what it means to kind of, and Marilyn with like the language poets, like, or kind of the quote unquote idea of the experimental avant-garde is removed from identity politics, where like that's not possible. And you know, it didn't really occur to me until way later that I've actually now done the opposite. Like, I literally gave myself a challenge one day. I was like, can I put Hello Kitty in a poem? Like, I want to be as like like, can I give you what you want, but also not at all? Like, this is mine. That's my Hello Kitty reference. And you can like think how Asian it is or whatever, but I thought a lot about that. And I thought a lot about the fact that I'm not literate in Chinese. I'm not fluent in Cantonese, Toisanese. I only know a little bit. And so I thought to myself, well, I want my book to have some Chinese in it. And I want it in particular moments where I am basically saying, I don't know, I've forgotten all my Chinese, or my mom dreams only in Cantonese and not in English. And so I used Google Translate, and I gave myself the permission to be like, I'll have the computer do it. I mean, like, and at the same time, acknowledge the fact that like, my not knowing, you know, Cantonese, not being literate is due to assimilation. Like, this is not my choice again. You know, whether or not someone's going to read a noodle in my poem as super Chinese or Hello Kitty, or that Chinese, like, oh, what does that mean in your poem? I'm like, I don't even know. I just put it through Google Translate. So I kind of like to play around with them now. So it feels kind of, I don't know, a bit more rebellious to just be like, to toy with them, I think, aka white readers. So I'll kind of stop there, but I've been having fun with that.
So you know, if I just say, if Ezra Pound is allowed to be a Chinese woman, why can't Marilyn Chin write about, you know, being Chinese? I just don't understand that. I mean, it is, you know, and I live in San Diego. I live right on the border of California and Tijuana, and so I'm learning Spanish, and I, you know, it is a very diverse community, and I relish all of it, and I'm informed and inspired by everything, you know. And so so I don't want to deny that, as you know, the Asian. I was, you know, I was born in Hong Kong. my undergraduate degree was in classical Chinese poetry. Should I pretend that that didn't happen? I mean, and my grandmother used to sing Chinese poems to me, should I pretend that didn't happen? I mean, we should use our strengths. And so, so there's all these conflicts and these problematic, things regarding writing poetry in the contemporary world. You can't listen to the noise, and that's very important. And I was looking at Dorothy's book, thinking its presence. It's really interesting because the poets within this book, we all had different voices. We had different strategies for the poems, and we each conceptualized the poem very differently. And so I think the diversity of voices is important. The diversity in a way we engage with form and content, and it's all right to wear too much embroidery. I just love embroidery.
That's right.
No, I think that's great, Mary. I mean, I think when I wrote the book, actually, I had a little bit of pressure from some people, not many, but some people said, just drop, do only the experimental writers.
Oh.
And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to show the range and the variety of Asian American writing. And I think that's really important, whether it's in the United States or in the UK, where you have Black British writing. I just wrote a preface to an anthology where, I think there should be an array of possibilities.
Right.
So why should it just be one or the other, or
Right.
one is privileged or one is condemned for writing? And that whole idea of like identity poetry, it's so deeply racist, actually.
Right.
So when white men write about their lives, it's not identity, it's universal, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
I think that's just the problem. So absolutely. So I think we have time, Jenny, right, to open it to some audience questions.
Yes.
I think. Okay, so why don't we open up to audience members? If people want to just turn on their mic, they can, or raise their hand. I guess, Jenny, you can watch that, or you can write something in the chat.
Yes, yeah. Is anyone interested to, just raise your question? You can just, unmute yourself. Let us know.
I could.
Yeah.
Okay. So as Marilyn will know, learning Spanish, the Spanish put an inverted question mark at the beginning of a question. So it's a question. And as I struggle to ask questions, please assume that I put an inverted question mark here. And then I'll just throw out a stream of words, which hopefully will give an opportunity for our poets to respond. I'm interested in what Jennifer Wong has described as writing a cross language. And, I too, from a different background from you guys, I have sort of wrestled with how much I should bring my own heritage and languages and also lost languages into my writing, or how much I should try to be, successful in a sort of mainstream English lit kind of way. So I related very much to what Jane said about using Google Translate, because in my case, I have to admit, I was using Google to look up Yiddish words, which my great-grandparents would have known, but which I didn't really know. But I also used words that I do remember and managed to drag out of my memory from my childhood, and a lot of it is words for food or for doing a wee and for your bottom and things like that. One of the dilemmas, which I think has been touched on in the conversation already, which I find very interesting and problematic, is in some ways writing from your own heritage. It does kind of come naturally, and why shouldn't you do it? And I think maybe it wasn't until very recently, but it has become quite marketable, I think. So I think, in some ways it's great to write from out of your background, from out of the ghetto, but you don't want to write yourself into a ghetto. And it's finding that, so my question, I suppose, is about finding that balance. I think also interesting is, to what extent does one write in English, or does one bring in other languages? I think it was remarkable that all three poets today, you've mostly been writing in English. Now, the American poet laureate, Joy Harjo, who comes from a Native American background, has described English as the enemy language, but nonetheless, you know, she has to write in English because her own language is, I think, probably largely lost, or certainly she wasn't fluent in her own Native American language. So, you know, to what extent do we bring other languages into the muddy stream of English, which is already a muddy language? And if we do bring heritage words in, should they be italicized? Should there be voluminous notes to explain them, or do we just put them in and sort of challenge the reader to, you know, yeah, well, you know, you can use, you know, the author can use Google Translate, so can the reader, and make the reader do some of the work. So there are those questions. I've probably asked enough questions already, actually, so I'll just stop there and put the correctly erected question mark in now.
Thank you, David. Anyone? Any?
I mean, you know, I think what I'm feeling when I'm looking at the state of poetry, right, is that it is capacious enough for all types of poetry to exist, to coexist, you know, from the really obscure avant-garde, you know, hypertext, fluff stuff, to, you know, the sort of poetry like that people on the street may know, you know, like Billy Collins or something, you know. And between those poles, then there can be poetry that explores heritage, explores language, you know. I mean, personally, for me, language, as Jane said, you know, I'm not a language expert when it comes to Chinese. I was born in the UK. I lived most of my life in Scotland. So actually, English is my language, and Chinese language for me is something that is as alien to me in some ways as it might be for you. So I don't feel any obligation at all to include it in my work, because it wouldn't be, you know, for me, it wouldn't feel authentic, because it's, you know, but I think, you know, the decisions to italicize, provide contextual notes, I think those are debates which have been long-standing in you know, throughout poetry. And I think it's a really personal decision that you have to sort of reckon with. And I think, you know, there's no one rule from the poetry overlords who will say, you know, you must italicize these foreign words, but it's about ultimately your relationship to your language and how distant or close that is, right?
I'm also seeing a great question in the chat, just so it doesn't get lost, by Pei O. Can you say a little more about what Asian affect might mean to a layperson? I don't know if Dorothy, if you want to check in with that, but I'm also very curious about, you know, what we define as Asian affect.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, do you mind if I just say a quick word about what Jay just said, which I just wanted to follow up for the first question, and then I'll say something about Asian affect, which I think Jay's right. I think poetry is capacious. It should be generous. I think for too long it's been, with critics especially, but with some poets, it's been very gatekeeping. And it's been very much like an elite club that people were, only certain select people were allowed in. Right. And I think that's wrong. It's not the way to think. Of course, you know, we all have tastes. We all have things that we like or don't like, or we think are good poetry, bad poetry. But I think that kind of preemptive gatekeeping has been very detrimental. And I think to address David's question partly, also, I think these sort of false oppositions between identity versus universal, like, you know, sort of like timeless work that's only formal. I mean, these are false oppositions, because going back to Pound, You know, that was, the cantos are deeply personal and they're also deeply political and problematic. I mean, real bad fascist politics, but still, you know, they did a lot of different things, and no one ever said, oh, but he's writing about himself, or it's just, you know, or it's too political, it's propagandistic. Maybe some people did, but you know, I think the sorts of false binaries and the kind of labels, it's been very, very deeply racialized, gendered, classed, you know. There's a lot of that went on, and I think it's time to really, I think it's sort of breaking down, but unfortunately, I think in the academy, it hasn't really, in departments of English, it hasn't really broken down. But I think on social media and among poets, it's been much more, things have been much more fluid, as Jay said. You could write political poetry that's also lyric, that's also experimental. It's not either or. So I just wanted to, but to go back to the question of Asian affect. Yeah, so basically, I think that, you know, I think that there's this general prevailing stereotype about Asian people, both men and women. And I think certainly in the United States, there's the model minority concept. And the idea of the proper affect is really a kind of deferential, quiet, I don't know, you guys could add more adjectives, you know, not angry, because unmodeled minority implies that the model minority implies there's an unmodeled minority, which is usually Blacks, Latinos. They're too full of rage, right? And so I think that idea of the kind, and that's gone on for a very long time with policies and things about who was, like the Chinese Exclusion Act excluded workers, but allowed business people and educated people. And so there's all sorts of ways in which there are good Asians and bad Asians, good Blacks and bad Blacks, good Latinx people, bad Latinx people. We know that. So I think the proper affect for so long for Asian Americans has been a kind of quietness, especially for women. And I think that's what Marilyn's poetry explodes a lot of the time. There's a kind of allowance. People can have Asian American women can express rage, and it should be allowable. It should not be punished. And I think going back to the first responses that people had about anger, I think anger can be very productive. I think Audre Lorde wrote about this, right? Can be extremely productive. And in fact, the entire introduction of my book was written in a state of absolute anger and rage.
Yes, right.
And what I had gone through as an Asian American woman in English departments for like any academy. So I think it's good if you can use it in a way that can do something to make change rather than turning it inward, which is what happens so often. So so affect, I guess, is just a fancy word for emotion, but I don't know if others want to add to that. Or maybe Peo, did you have a follow-up, or did you want to add to did that clarify what your question was?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to hear a bit more about, you know, what that might be. And, you know, because I guess over the diaspora, we're kind of very intersectional, because of course we are not all the same at all, and there's so much diversity among all of us. And so, yeah, what would be the affect of, you know, this part of society, I guess, our group, or the group that we are in? That's quite an interesting discussion, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that, as with poetry, that Asian Americans and other minority, Asian minority people, whether they're in the UK or wherever in the world, or other racial minorities, they should be allowed to have the full range of affect, like the three-dimensional range that white people are allowed, right? Because white people are allowed to have every sort of affect. And that should be the case, and the same with poetry, and that should be the same within poetry, that people should have every kind of, you know, dimensionality, which means including the negative emotions like cravenness, greed, you know, corruption. I mean, that should be allowable. So I think that you don't want to have just a romanticized, like, you know, the sort of antidote is not to have like romanticized versions of people, because, you know, when we think back on history, I'm sure there were like really horrible, you know, Asian Americans like exploiting others, as we know, on the railroad and stuff. But you know, but that's okay. That's all right. You know, so I don't know, Marilyn or others, or Jane or Jay want to add to that, or if there's another question.
I was thinking back to, you know, both you, Dorothy, and Jay speaking to like capaciousness too, and thinking about that in relationship to affect. And I don't know, I think so much of my life has been pushing against these expectations of that quietude, and especially being quite femme and, you know, quite sexualized and exoticized. I tend to overcompensate and get like really into people's faces. You know, to be outwardly so. And I wonder, like, you know, does that not allow for the times in which I am quite quiet and when I am quite tender and a bit, you know, a bit more, you know, reserved. And that's really interesting, right? That I almost feel kind of like I can't allow myself to be quiet. When at times, obviously, I am. And sometimes I don't want to be enraged. But I almost feel sometimes pushed into that, especially in my poetry, because of what I'm fighting against, what I'm resisting as the kind of baseline stereotypical affect, or what people expect of me. So I've been working, I think, lately on really thinking through what that means for me and what that means in terms of allowing all the multitudes of how I think and feel and move through the world, with all our different layers, to allow myself all of that, instead of just having to be quote unquote tough, strong, and resilient. I'm tired of resilient in the sense of, I don't know, being like patted on the back for like doing all that hard work. I'm just like, I just want a nap. I want to be quiet sometimes. And I just want to like eat dumplings and just be quiet. And maybe that is fitting into someone's vision of what they want from me. But I'm like, that's mine. I get to hold that as much as me literally like ripping off the head of a racist white dude who says something to me in the street. So I can have both. And I think that,
yeah. Oh, sorry, Jane, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no, go ahead. That's all I wanted to say.
That's a really good point, because the point of allowing people a full range of emotions is not to say that everyone has to be like enraged or going in people's faces. But I think you're right. I think there are young Asian American scholars now working on like aspects of quietude, or what it means, not like how silence can be also a form of power. And so I think that sort of re-signifying those things, but it's hard because there is a prevailing kind of stereotype, right? But
also the generation that that Dorothy wrote about in her book, John Yao and I had to really face off, you know, poets, white poets, and as Dorothy called, you know, the gatekeepers. We've had to argue, you know, on our behalf. You know, so our generation will really, you know, this problem with the poetry world and the gatekeepers, that's, you know, and their preconceptions were in our face. Their racism is, you know, and we had to fight every inch of the way. So we didn't have the privilege of, sitting back and enjoying the quietude. I do have a lot of quietude in the work, and it's all because, you know, it's because of my Buddhism and whatever, my grandmother's Buddhism, but we had to fight every inch of the way. So I want to clarify this. It's not it's not that I don't love quietude, but we weren't privileged in that way.
Yeah, I just want to echo that, Marilyn. That fight is like, it's like at the ready at all times. Like there's always that feeling like you're readying yourself for it, no matter what. Yeah.
And Dorothy and I knew June Jordan, and June Jordan took me aside and said, "You're too nice." Okay.
Right. No, I TA'd for June Jordan. That's when I met Marilyn the first time when I was a grad student at Berkeley. So, but I think that's absolutely right. Because, you know, when I wrote the book, actually, Leon Lee, you know, sort of, we talked a little bit, I don't know him that well, but he did thank me for it. But he did say, you know, I wish people would write more about the metaphysical stuff in my poetry. And I said, oh, I wish that too. I said, unfortunately, because the book that I wrote was really about dealing with the racial thing. But of course, there are all these other dimensions to everyone's poetry, right? It's not just the racial thing. It's not just, but because, like Marilyn said, a space has to be cleared. And that's hard. You know, that space has to be cleared so someone can write about the metaphysical or what, you know, what other elements. But when there's so much of an Orientalist colonial frame, And I, I hear Marilyn because my parents were English professors. And they, and that was a very, very tough time to be from China as immigrants working in British literature in the 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s. My father passed away. So it's really, I wish it could just have been that everyone was like, oh, that's fine. Your English is good. You're coming from China. That's fine. But it doesn't work that way, right? So sometimes those battles had to be fought in order to clear a space. But I don't know if there are other questions, Jenny.
There is another question from Sophie. So Sophie, would you like to say your question?
Yeah, sorry, I am like really ill right now, so my voice is a disaster. But this is kind of, I guess, a little less about it being experimental, but more just a question about, so if we think about poetry as sort of like community healing, like telling community stories, and if everyone's sort of first community is their family, and I feel like a lot of the Asian or Chinese diaspora do have a sort of cultural and language barrier with their parents' generation, with their grandparents' generation. How do you see sharing your poetry with your family? How do you go about doing that? Do you choose to do that? Because I guess like a lot of the content of your poetry is quite maybe shocking for people of our parents' generation or of our grandparents' generation, or quite the ideas potentially are quite new. So do you see your poetry as mainly for your contemporaries and your peers, or do you then maybe like translate for family, or how do you share with your family your poetry, if you do or don't?
I can just say that I don't really share my poetry with my family. They want me to share. I choose not to, because I just feel that, I'm sure they found some of it online, but they're not creative people. They don't come from any sort of background where they read poetry in English, especially, and poetry in English is what I'm writing, and they don't read contemporary poetry, and so for them there will always be this sort of this barrier of cultural translation, right? Not literally translation, but cultural translation. And I find that that's okay, because I'm not writing for my family myself. I'm writing for me, right? Essentially, as the sort of reader, right? And it's sort of besides the point whether they get it or not for me. But that's just my.
Yeah, I love that answer, Jay, because it is for us. And I think that is to some degree, maybe a privilege. I don't know, because I think about this all the time, that, my family aren't like, they don't read it in English. Like, I'm first generation, a college graduate, high school too. So they don't really read. And in fact, I don't even know if some of my family on my mom's side knows that I do this work. It's almost, and my father's not in my life, and so I almost feel like I can pretty much say and do whatever I want. Like because of that freedom, because of the language barrier, I can kind of do whatever I want. However, I mean, they certainly have feelings about how I dress and other things that are, of course, related to the poems in many ways. I mean, my personality is very similar to my poems. But as far as the work itself, I feel like I do feel lucky in a strange way that I don't have to encounter criticism, because they're not going to find it. My mom she does want to read my poems, in particular the ones about her and in her voice, because she's kind of vain and she loves them, and she's just always like, yes, that's me, absolutely, keep writing about me. And so that's the one thing, is that my mom reads the poems about her. She likes them.
There's also another another question from Jin Hao. Jin Hao, would you like to mention your question?
Yes, okay. Thank you all for sharing your poems and your thoughts as well. I have a question about your sort of experimentation of poetics. What does it look like for you, like every day, rather than like you are when you're not writing poems? Like, what does that experimentation mean to you?
Well, we lead very boring lives. Most of us are academics, right? But during lockdown, I've been going to the duck pond and writing, little fragments because, I mentioned Richard Wright. I just bought, he wrote 1,000 or more haiku, in his last years as he was dying. And so I read them, and some of them are really beautiful, and some of them are really strange. So I was leaving. So yeah, I mean, it's sad to say, but we're all in academia, which I just retired recently, so I feel like I could set it aside, academia aside for a while, but I don't know. Will there be an Asian American Ginsberg coming from the street? I mean, I don't know. Or will there be, will there be a recluse, poet like Emily Dickinson? I don't know. You have to have 10,000 likes on your Instagram. I mean, it's really a different world, and my daily life is rather boring, right? Most of us teach and go home, and but one thing I can say after, I love the genre. I love poetry, and I read it every day, and that's been very healing through this this lockdown and through all this pain and suffering the world's going through. So I am so grateful to have this. I just love this genre. I just, and mixing genres and whatever. I mean, I just, and I feel like I'm an ambassador for poetry, because I want it to survive, the poems and poets to survive and to flourish. That's.
I guess I just want to raise quickly related to that point, as a poet who is trying to start my journey into academia, perhaps foolishly, please feel free to dissuade me from that path now. I've actually found it really useful to read theory, which has its own problems, 100%, gatekeeping, accessibility, difficulty, but especially theory about diaspora or Chinese or Sinophone studies, right? So like that has really helped me experiment with my notions of diaspora. So like Ray Chow, Shumi Shi, like these theorists have really managed to sort of allow my thinking to experiment in some ways, even if I don't understand it 100%.
Wow, I love that. I feel like I need to come back to theory, maybe with a more open arms these days, because I feel like when I did my PhD, I was like so into it, so in it, and then I've actually, speaking of like a boring life, I've kind of really let go of the academy, which is really interesting, even though I teach in it. I feel like in my classroom, I mean, yeah, I'm like obsessed with poetry. I feel like I think of all the things so tied to poetry, that's like a tentacle of poetry. And I find new tentacles all the time, such as like ceramics. Like I feel like playing with clay feels like kind of making a poem. Like it really does. Like I'm looking at the clay and it looks like a block of tofu, and then you cut it and it's a beautiful, like just that fluidity. And then you basically wedge it, and you have to use your entire body. And I think about like you're forming it, right, into a shape, into language that's, so I experiment with that lately. For instance, lately I pulled some seaweed from the ocean, and I actually put it into my my bowl, and we're going to fire it this week. So I don't know if the salt from the seaweed will make interesting bubbles in the clay, into the pottery. So I've been doing that. I garden, and so I'm always failing. I love to fail, and I think something about poetry is like ultimate failure. I love falling like face flat on a poem, being like, it's not, what is work? You know, when people say, is this poem working? I'm like, no, this poem's not trying to go to its job. Like, this poem is, what? And so I love when poems are messy, and when my garden's messy. I have no idea what I plant ever. I never put in the little sign that says, this is what this is, a carrot. So I don't know. I think that's hopefully an answer, is just like, I experiment, I think, just in failure. That's it. I mean, I like to fail, which is funny because I think a lot of people would say like, oh, you're so successful, or you've been doing well. And of course we have obviously stereotypes around, you know, that model minority and success. But actually, I really like to fail. And I think it's thrilling, like that precipice of something kind of almost there. And then it just like, the tomatoes never ripen and they always are green. So yeah.
Amazing. Dorothy, there's another question. Would you?
Yeah, actually, yeah, there's a question from Jennifer. Lita. Jennifer, do you want to read it, or do you want me to read your question? I guess it's a pretty long question. Okay, I'll read it. It says, thank you so my eyes are not very good, so that's why I'm kind of straining. Thank you so, actually, Jenny, can you read it? Because I have.
Yeah, I can read it. It's okay.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this event. It's been really beautiful. So yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Marilyn, Jane, Jay, for your amazing readings. And I was wondering if you could say something a bit about how pronouns operate in the poems that you read this evening, and more generally. So I was really struck by, you know, Jane's use of we in the poems that she read, and also Marilyn's various uses of different pronouns. So, you know, I picked up on I, you know, as in the line, I want to laugh in open air. You know, we in the little girl etudes, and she in the poem Little Box Opens Up. And then Jay also, yeah, used I in the poem he read. And so I was thinking kind of all this in relation to Dorothy's discussion of pronouns, and particularly, you know, the use of the confessional autobiographical I in John Yau's work. You know, I think Dorothy also talks about, you know, multiple perspectives and pronouns in Marilyn's work. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could all say something about how pronouns operate in your work.
Anyone? I love this question because I love pronouns. Like, I'm obsessed with them. So when I'm teaching, I'm always looking at the pronouns, always pointing them to I love Jennifer's question because I'm always pointing to them with my students in poems. Like, what's the pronoun? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think pronouns are really interesting. And also I'm just kind of thinking about just in relation to, you know, the use of the lyric I, which has been talked about so much in contemporary poetry. And yeah, and kind of what that means to us as poets, and, you know, what we're kind of signaling as well when we use different pronouns. Yeah, I mean, I found it just really inspiring, and you know, that both Jane and Marilyn, you know, feel empowered enough to use we, for example, you know, in the poems that they read. So yeah, I'm just interested to hear more about what you think about.
Well, you know, or, you know, I come from I'm a confessional poet. I hate to, you know, use that word. It's a terrible word, but at very young, I read Sylvia Plath, and so yeah, and the confessional. We can't pretend that it never happened in, you know, especially in American poetry, in the contemporary American poetry scene. And also I know I also write in masque, in dramatic monologue.
Yeah.
So I am Marilyn Chin. Oh, how I love the resoluteness of that first person singular, followed by that stalwart indicative of be without the. So when I read that poem, the I is a constructed I. It's autobiographical, has my personal and familiar history, but I'm also using a mask. I'm using a voice that is an extended version of Marilyn Chin, of the poet. And I learned that from from Shakespeare, from T.S. Eliot,
Yeah.
So that's the we, it's we're going back, if we go back to June Jordan, this is a poem about my rights, and she's, it's a spoken word thing. She just speaks out that poem, and so the self, as a second wave feminist, the self often represents something larger than the self, the tribe, the nation, the village. So I and we, but in some poems, in several poems, I tried to write in Chinese first, in very bad Chinese, a couple lyrics, one called Tether the Dog. I wrote in Chinese first. I took out all the connectives. I took out all the pronouns, and it sounded really weird. It sounded like Chinglish. So I put some pronouns back in. So there's a lot of play, with pronouns. It's right now, it's so loaded. It's so right now. So yeah. Thank you for your question. I struggle with the pronoun often, but it's.
No, not at all. I mean, it was really inspiring and brilliant, to hear how they're used, so variously. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I also was going to say, I think sometimes there's an implied you too in the poems. Like,
yeah.
There's often like, who's the you, who's the reader, who's the reader, and I think that happens often as well, consciously or unconsciously. I don't know if Jay or Jane want to say something about pronouns.
I'll just also say too, I mean, I love teaching your work, Marilyn, because I feel like students, like in particular that poem you just mentioned, how I got that name, when you use the third person too towards the end, and say your own name, like my students were like, wait, what's going on with the shifting here? And I just love the way too, there's so much kind of like a play on like who is actually speaking, like the multiple selves within ourselves too. I love that idea that my poet self is a very different person than just me. I started writing nonfiction, and that's a different me first, like definitely, like when I write in different genres, I feel like a different I voice. I love the we because I find, at least when I was writing that poem, it just felt like I wanted there to be like a chorus almost, like I wanted my ancestors to kind of sing to me. And then when I sometimes write in that I voice, a lyric I, it's sometimes not me, right? It's often my mother. And so I think that's really strange when we combine together. It's half Jane, half Jin, and it's kind of this weird amalgamation. But yeah, I love that kind of mixture of like pronouns and being able to, I think like, for me, it's about deeply listening. I think in whatever I'm doing in terms of writing a persona poem, my mother's voice, or through my ancestors, or even thinking about writing to myself, like I feel like the pronouns to me indicate a certain type of way to tune my ear to listen to whoever's trying to speak to me, including myself. So I've been thinking about that lately and thinking about pronouns. But yeah, I don't know, Jay, if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add very briefly. I really resonated with what you said, Marilyn, about the I being the mask, because the I is never the author, but kind of is perhaps in some ways, so that's the sort of paradox of poetry, right? But for me, as someone who I must confess, I rarely write autobiographically. In fact, lots of my poems are made up in most senses of the word. I view, and yet I still choose to use the I, because I view it as a sort of, I don't know if anyone's played Dungeons or Dragons or Warcraft, as a sort of role-playing. You're role-playing the I. I've created a character, and I'm setting this character off on their quest. To me, there's a sort of playfulness in using the I, which I want to really explore.
Just wanted to briefly mention, actually, Jennifer is going to read in one of the other events later on the 1st of October, just to, she's very modest to mention.
Thank you, that was really interesting.
Thanks for that question. Jenny, how are we doing on time? I'm not sure what the...
Yes. I believe we have gone through all the questions, and I think it's almost time to wrap up, unless you have anything to add, Dorothy or the other panel poets. But if not, I just wanted to thank you all, for such an amazing evening or amazing day, such a brilliant discussion. And Dorothy, thank you so much for your insights on experimental poetics and selfhood, race, and all these really potent issues. And thank you, Marilyn, Jane, and Jay, for all your amazing reading and discussion. And thank you to the audience as well for such a, coming to join us and we're coming up with all these thought-provoking ideas. So thank you, and hope you have a good rest of the week, and do join us if you can, and check out our events in the coming week as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. That was great. Thanks for the audience questions.
Remember to buy the books, by the way.
Thank you, everybody. It's been fun. It was fun.
Thank you so much.
Everyone, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you.